war had bathed the new century in blood. Endless fields of grave markers quilted the landscape of Europe. Nine million had been killed in a horrible war of attrition that saw commanding officers throw life away cheaply for a few yards of ground. A whole generation was traumatized by the horror of the trenches.
What I thought about most was the pals that I'd left behind me who would never see home again. They gave their lives, and they didn't know what they were giving them for. They were giving their lives to end wars, which didn't end wars.
Walter Hare was only 20 at war's end.
I'd been one of the lucky ones. I'd survived, and I hoped and felt that this was the end of war for all of us. I was thankful that I was at home. I was thankful that my brother had survived too, and I was thankful that none of my people had suffered because of the war. But I felt sorry for all those people who had, and especially those people in our village who had lost some of their lads.
All the combatants felt the same emotions, whether their side had won or lost. In Munich, young Karl Nagerl watched as the German troops came back.
It was a relief for the whole nation that the war was over. We had to wait and see what the consequences would be. As a small boy, I was happy my father was home, that the family was together, and we counted on him to bring family life back to normal.
He hoped he'd never have to fight like his father. The world's hopes of a lasting peace were focused on one man. Woodrow Wilson, the scholarly 28th President of the United States, was hailed as a new messiah when he arrived for the peace conference in Paris. He had brought America into the war in 1917, ensuring an Allied victory. Among his entourage was young Edward Bernays.
I was on the Champs-Élysées when Wilson arrived, and he was greeted with people cheering, taking off their hats and holding them in their hand above their heads to greet the savior of humanity who had made the world safe for democracy.
He doffed his hat left and right. He was very polite. Everyone shouted, "Long live America." We knew they were our saviors. So he was really acclaimed in Paris and everywhere he went. The atmosphere was one of high patriotism because we'd won the war.
Wilson promised the enthusiastic crowds what he called a people's peace, a peace based on his own high principles, a lenient peace that would last and be fair to all. But other leaders like Britain's Lloyd George disagreed, as did Clemenceau of France. They had different concerns to be addressed. The peace conference was held in the ornate Palace of Versailles. Wilson set the agenda. He wanted self-determination and democracy to be the guiding principles, and to ensure peaceful resolution of future conflicts, an entirely new organization would be created, the League of Nations. But France, fearful of German rearmament, insisted that Germany be handicapped by having to pay the full cost of the war in reparations. German representatives were given no chance to negotiate. They were forced to accept their guilt and sign a punitive settlement.
Nachdem die Bedingungen des Versailler Vertrags bekannt geworden waren.
When the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were announced, the German people were dismayed about the conditions that were imposed, dismayed at everything that was expected of us, dismayed at the payments we had to make, that were sure to lead the German nation to ruin.
Die das deutsche Volk zum Ruin führen mussten.
The treaty, setting up the League of Nations, scheduling war reparations, redrawing frontiers, was designed to prevent war from ever happening again. But few who welcomed the settlement at the time wanted to acknowledge the problems it was storing up for the future. For the moment, the victors ignored the anger of the Germans. But German humiliation and resentment would fester and grow. And the main architect of the peace would soon find that many Americans at home wanted nothing to do with his League of Nations. The tangled politics of Versailles didn't dampen the spirits of soldiers the world over, just happy to be coming home. Walter Hare returned to Yorkshire.
The villagers, after we'd been home, a week or two I think it was, they arranged for a coming home party for the lads. It was nice, very happy, we had a good meal and a lot of sing-song and sort of a get-together. Some of us were caught in with our girlfriends again, and quite a happy do.
The United States had sent 2 million of its sons to sort out Europe's problems, and in the spring of 1919, they too were heading home, including McKinley Wooden.
When we left St. Nazaire, we was all tickled to be on the boat headed for home. The boys was all glad to get on it, and as it started out, one looked over his shoulder and says, "I love to see France over my shoulder." We bid Europe goodbye. We didn't think we'd ever have to be back.
The United States welcomed home its victorious troops, relieved that the costly European adventure was over. Most Americans in 1919 were anxious to get back to the good life at home and forget about Europe. In this atmosphere, Congress refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, effectively blocking America's participation in the League of Nations. Wilson went on a whirlwind tour of the country to drum up popular support for the League and force Congress to reconsider. "I can predict with absolute certainty," he wrote, "that within another generation there will be another world war, unless the nations of the world concert the methods by which to prevent it." The president was welcomed with enthusiasm, but Americans feared that joining the League of Nations might someday force them into fighting other people's wars. Wilson's message of America's international responsibility was rejected.
There was no great feeling for any internationalism as a basis for peace and prosperity.
By the end of 1919, Wilson was ailing, felled by a stroke. He would never overcome America's resistance to joining the League of Nations. For the time being, Europe would be left to its own devices.